For almost a century, Western society has repeated one promise: go to school, study hard, earn your undergraduate degree, and a good job will follow. It wasn't just parents who believed it. Teachers taught it. Politicians promoted it. Universities built entire institutions around it. Entire economies expanded access to higher education because it was believed that a more educated population would produce a richer society. And for a long time, that promise seemed true. So why are millions of graduates across the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and much of Europe sending hundreds of applications, only to receive silence? How did we end up in a world where employers complain they cannot find qualified workers, while graduates complain nobody will hire them? How can both be true? The answer begins nearly a century ago. To understand today's graduate crisis, we first need to understand why university degrees became so valuable in the first place. For much of the early 20th century, very few people attended university. In the United States during the 1940s, only a small fraction of young adults earned bachelor's degrees. Across much of Europe, university education remained largely reserved for the social elite. A degree wasn't simply an education. It was a scarce signal, and in economics, scarcity creates value. When only a small percentage of society possesses something, that thing naturally becomes more valuable. But scarcity wasn't the only reason employers valued graduates. In 1973, economist Michael Spence published a paper that would later earn him the Nobel Prize. His theory was surprisingly simple. Before hiring someone, employers know very little about them. They don't know how disciplined they are. They don't know how quickly they learn. They don't know how they'll behave under pressure. And they certainly don't know whether they'll justify the salary they're about to receive. Hiring is one of the biggest financial risks a company makes. So employers look for signals, not proof. Signals. A university degree became one of the strongest signals available. Not because university magically transformed every student into an exceptional employee, but because surviving several years of higher education suggested something difficult to observe directly: persistence, discipline, the ability to learn, and the ability to complete difficult tasks. The degree became a shortcut, a way of reducing uncertainty. And for decades, that shortcut worked remarkably well because graduates were rare. But signals only work when they remain rare. Imagine receiving a handwritten letter in the mail. Years ago, it would immediately capture your attention. Almost nobody writes handwritten letters anymore. Now, imagine receiving 100 handwritten letters every single morning. The very thing that once made each letter special would slowly lose its power. The same thing happened to university degrees. After the Second World War, Western governments made one of the biggest educational investments in modern history. The United States introduced the GI Bill. Britain dramatically expanded universities. Across Europe, governments subsidized higher education on an unprecedented scale. The reasoning seemed obvious. Industrial economies were becoming more complex. Factories were becoming automated. Offices were becoming larger. Science and engineering were advancing rapidly. The future appeared to belong to knowledge. If more citizens became educated, society would become wealthier. And initially, it worked. Millions of families escaped poverty. Entire generations entered professions their parents could never have imagined. Higher education became one of the greatest engines of social mobility in modern history, but hidden inside that success was the beginning of another story. Every year, universities produced more graduates than the year before. Every decade, the number continued growing. The signal that once separated people started appearing everywhere. Sociologist Randall Collins would later describe this process as credential inflation. The principle was surprisingly simple. As more people earned degrees, employers quietly increased educational requirements. Jobs that once required a high school diploma now preferred a bachelor's. Jobs that once required a bachelor started asking for a master's, not because the work itself had fundamentally changed, but because employers suddenly had far more applicants than available positions. Imagine you're hiring for one marketing position. In 1975, you received 20 applications. In 2025, you received 2,000. The problem isn't finding educated people. The problem is choosing between them. So employers begin inventing new filters: more qualifications, more certificates, more experience, more internships, more software skills. Yesterday's advantage quietly became today's minimum requirement. The degree hadn't become worthless. Its ability to distinguish one graduate from another had, but something even bigger was happening. Most people believe graduates changed. They didn't. The economy changed first. For much of the 20th century, economic growth usually meant hiring more people. As companies expanded, they needed more accountants, more assistants, more managers, more engineers, and more graduates. Growth created employment. Employment created opportunity. Opportunity rewarded education. Everything seemed connected. Then, the relationship began to break apart. Computers automated clerical work. Spreadsheets replaced entire accounting departments. Email replaced mailrooms. Cloud software eliminated filing systems. Globalization allowed companies to move routine work across continents. Manufacturing increasingly shifted toward countries with lower labor costs. Businesses became leaner, smaller, and more efficient. Then came artificial intelligence. The first time in modern history, many companies discovered they could increase production without increasing the number of employees. Economists call this productivity growth. For investors, it was excellent news. Higher productivity often meant higher profits. For graduates, it meant something completely different. Economic growth no longer guaranteed graduate hiring. A company could become twice as productive without hiring twice as many graduates, sometimes without hiring anyone at all. And yet universities continued preparing students as though the old relationship still existed. Study hard, graduate, find a job. But the economy had quietly rewritten the rules. Most students simply never noticed. Not until graduation, the first place most graduates discover that the world has changed isn't inside a classroom. It isn't in an economics textbook. It isn't even at graduation. It's inside their email inbox. One application, no reply, 10 applications. Still nothing, 50 applications, only automated rejection emails, 100 applications, silence at first. Most graduates assume they're doing something wrong. Maybe the CV needs improving. Maybe the cover letter wasn't convincing. Maybe someone else was simply better. But after months of rejection, the question slowly changes. Instead of asking, "Why didn't I get this job?" they begin asking, "What's wrong with me?" And that's where economics quietly becomes psychology. Think about the educational system for a moment. From the age of 5, life follows an incredibly predictable pattern: study. Take the exam, pass the exam, move to the next level. Every success reinforces the same lesson: effort leads to reward. Psychologists have understood this principle for decades. When behaviors are repeatedly rewarded, the brain begins expecting those rewards. By the time someone graduates from university, they've spent nearly 20 years living inside that system. Study harder, receive better grades, work longer, get promoted to the next class. The relationship between effort and reward feels almost natural, almost guaranteed. Then graduation happens, and suddenly the rules disappear. Nobody tells you what chapters to study. Nobody gives you deadlines. Nobody tells you how many applications will be enough. Most importantly, nobody guarantees that effort will produce results. For many graduates, this is the first time in their lives that working harder doesn't necessarily move them forward. Psychologically, that's an enormous shock. But there's another misunderstanding hiding beneath the surface. Students spend years believing employers are buying education. Businesses don't think that way. Imagine you own a company. Every employee costs money: salary, training, insurance, equipment, management time, office space, mistakes. Hiring someone isn't just adding another person. It's making an investment. And every investment carries risk. Before an employer asks, "How educated is this person?" they're usually asking something else. Can this person solve problems without creating bigger ones? Notice how different those questions are. Universities measure knowledge. Businesses measure value. Universities reward understanding. Businesses reward outcomes. Universities ask whether you know the answer. Businesses ask whether you can apply it under pressure. Those are two completely different systems, and yet millions of graduates assume they're the same. Management professor Peter Capelli has spent years studying this contradiction. He noticed something strange. Companies regularly complain about talent shortages, while graduates regularly complain about job shortages. Both groups believe they're telling the truth. So where's the contradiction? Capelli argues that many employers have gradually shifted the cost of training onto workers themselves. Instead of hiring promising graduates and teaching them, many firms now search for candidates who already possess the exact combination of skills, software knowledge, and experience they need. In other words, companies aren't just looking for potential anymore. They're looking for certainty. From the employer's perspective, that makes perfect economic sense. Training costs money, mistakes cost money, a poor hire costs money. The less uncertainty, the lower the risk. From the graduate's perspective, it creates an impossible question. How am I supposed to get experience if nobody will hire me first? It's a question millions ask every year, and it has no easy answer. Then comes another force, one that's much harder to measure: comparison. Every morning, LinkedIn announces another graduate program, another promotion, another success story. Instagram fills with office selfies, new apartments, and new careers. Meanwhile, your own inbox remains empty. Psychologist Leon Festinger called this social comparison theory. Human beings naturally judge themselves by comparing themselves with other people. For thousands of years, this helped us understand our place within small communities. Today, we compare ourselves with millions of people every single day. The problem is, we compare our private struggles with everyone else's public victories. We never see the applications they never posted. We never see the interviews they failed. We never see the panic attacks before assessment centers. We never see the months they questioned themselves. We only see the offer letter. And slowly, the labor market stops feeling competitive. It starts feeling personal. This is where another psychological theory begins explaining something economists can't. In 1957, psychologist Leon Festinger introduced cognitive dissonance. It describes the discomfort people feel when two deeply held beliefs collide. For graduates, those beliefs are painfully simple. Education creates opportunity, and I did everything education asked of me. So why isn't the opportunity appearing? When reality contradicts expectation, the brain searches desperately for an explanation. Sometimes it concludes that the expectation was wrong, but much more often it concludes that the person is wrong. Maybe I'm not intelligent enough. Maybe I'm not employable. Maybe everyone else is simply better. Notice what happened. An economic problem has quietly become an identity problem. The graduate is no longer questioning the labor market, they're questioning themselves. And that's a much heavier burden to carry. The tragedy is that this psychological shift changes behavior. At first, graduates apply everywhere, then they become more selective, then they hesitate before clicking apply. Eventually, some stop applying altogether, not because opportunities disappeared, but because hope did. Psychologist Martin Seligman described something remarkably similar decades ago. He called it learned helplessness. When people repeatedly experience failure despite genuine effort, they eventually stop believing their actions matter. This isn't laziness. It isn't weakness. It's a psychological adaptation. The mind begins protecting itself from constant disappointment. Perhaps the greatest cost of graduate unemployment isn't financial. It's psychological. Because once people stop believing their actions can change their future, everything changes. Relationships become harder, confidence disappears, ambition shrinks, dreams become smaller. The first casualty isn't income, it's identity, but perhaps the biggest question still remains unanswered. If universities continue producing graduates, if graduates continue investing years of their lives, and if employers continue demanding skilled workers, then why does this cycle continue decade after decade? Perhaps the problem isn't graduates. Perhaps the problem isn't employers either. Perhaps the real problem is that universities and labor markets were designed for two completely different purposes. Universities exist to create and preserve knowledge. Businesses exist to create value and generate profit. One rewards learning, the other rewards productivity. For decades, those two goals happen to align. Today, they're slowly drifting apart. And until education evolves as quickly as the economy itself, millions of graduates will continue leaving university believing they've reached the finish line, only to discover the race has only just begun. Because perhaps the biggest lesson of all is this: a university degree was never a guarantee of employment. It was a signal, and like every signal, its value depends entirely on the world that's interpreting it. The world changed, the signal changed, but the promise never did.